Well, hi everyone. I hope you're all keeping well. It's great to be able to join you for a time of further reflection on the themes we explored in last Sunday's sermon. And if you were with us then, or if you've caught up on the service online, you'll know that this was our covenant renewal service, a Sunday in the year when we make promises to one another in response to God and what he has done for us in Jesus, the new life he has given us, the new relationship we have with him, and also the new relationships we can have with one another. And we looked at these themes through the perspective of Deuteronomy 7, a passage where God speaks to Israel of his covenant commitment to them and the commitment he desires in return as the moment approaches when they will cross over into the promised land. And then we also reflected briefly on 1 Peter 2, where Peter takes language and terminology the Jews of his time would have been familiar with, some of that Deuteronomy language, the ideas of being chosen and set apart by God, and he applies them to the church. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. And as we reflected on those passages, you might recall that the big question we explored was this: that as we reflect on faith, on the call God has made on our lives to be disciples of Jesus and to be part of the church, who do we see as the star of the story? Who do we see as the main mover? It goes without saying that in response to what God has done for us, it's only right that we live out our faith by way of acts of service to God and neighbour, and that we seek to show God's love to those around us by way of the various activities and programs that we share in together. But we also need to be aware of a danger in all of this, that if we're not careful, we can come to attach too much significance to our actions and lose sight of what God is doing below the surface. We can all fall into the trap of thinking that the only way God works is through our activity. And I think this is an added pressure in a time when many churches feel themselves to be on the back foot, when there isn't always the growth we long to see, when it feels harder than ever to find volunteers to sustain what we do. Sometimes it feels like we're having to work harder than ever just to hold our own, let alone grow. And in a situation like this, it's always tempting to think, if we just worked harder, if we just made more effort, if we could just find some new program, that missing piece, then we will see the turnaround we hope for. And as we explored on Sunday, the danger of all of this is twofold. Firstly, it causes us to load even more pressure on ourselves. We take on ourselves the responsibility of growing the church. We feel it's all on us to make things happen. And secondly, and even more importantly, in all of this, we lose sight of the love of God, of his grace, and of the fact that he is the one who will build his church. He is the one who first called us into relationship with him. He is the star of the story. And to use an analogy we talked about on Sunday, we are merely called to be supporting actors. This is one of the key points we reflected on when we looked at Deuteronomy 7, those wonderful verses when God reminds Israel of the love he has for them, which is the basis of their relationship with him. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. as I was saying on Sunday, the language which is used in this passage is very intimate. What's translated here as set his affection on you is a Hebrew word which in other places is used to describe the attraction which comes when two people are romantically drawn to one another. And yet God says that his attraction towards Israel is not on the basis of anything special about them. And as we said on Sunday, in some ways that might seem strange to us, but in other ways it isn't. Part of the experience that we all have of being loved is of sometimes wondering, what is it that the person who loves us sees in us? And these verses also point us to a principle that we see played out in Scripture on numerous occasions in both the Old and New Testaments. The most of the people who God uses turn out to be flawed in one way or another, inconsistent, timid, sometimes resisting the very idea that he's called them to serve him. But maybe that's just as well. If God only used impressive people, they might think it was their talents and not his power that was changing situations. And ordinary people like us might end up thinking we could never be used at all. But all of this brings me to the first question I'd encourage us to reflect upon this week. How does it change our attitude to what we do for God to know that we are unconditionally loved by God? Why don't you take some time to discuss this now? Think about the various roles which you undertake in church, the areas of service you're involved with, and ask yourself, what difference does it make to know that in all of this, I am loved by God, that God does not love me for any special skill or ability that I bring to the table, but for who I am. And that Selsdon Baptist Church is loved because God has set his heart upon us, not because of things we do, not with an expectation that we be bigger or better than anyone else. So why don't you hit the pause button and take some time to discuss that now. And so now to our next question. As we reflected on Sunday, although Israel's relationship with God is one which is based on his love, which begins as a consequence of the move first made towards them by God, it is not one where the commitment only flows one way. God longs for a response from Israel, something he makes clear in verse 11. Therefore take care to follow the commands, decrees and laws I give you today. The Old Testament scholar John Goldengate makes a very helpful, really well expressed comment on these verses. This is what he says. That while God's election is not based on anything Israel has done, it needs to issue in things that Israel does. God's love is unconditional in the sense that it is not conditioned by anything we have done, but it makes absolute demands. And while noting that Israel had not earned its special relationship with God through what it did, Deuteronomy adds that this special relationship will only work if Israel responds to God's commitment with a commitment of its own. And that need to make a commitment of our own was one of the principles which underpin what we did on Sunday at our covenant service. Just as God makes a commitment to us, so we commit to service of him in this place, and we also commit to walking with one another. This is a vitally important aspect of following God, of being disciples of Jesus. That it's not just something we do as individuals, but in community alongside other believers. God makes a commitment to a specific people, Israel, and a commitment to the church. And he asks us to commit ourselves to other people. Something we all need to remember, and especially at the times when we inevitably experience misunderstandings or rub up against each other the wrong way. So here's another question for us to consider. How does it change your understanding of church to think of the commitment you make to other people being a form of response to God's love for you? Why don't you hit the pause button and take some time to discuss this amongst yourselves? And our final question to consider, as we noted on Sunday, the idea that the people of God relate to God on the basis not of what they have done, but rather what he has begun in them and done for them, is something we see not just in the Old Testament, but the New. We heard again earlier that verse from 1 Peter 2, where Peter draws very much on the terminology of Deuteronomy and other passages which describe Israel in the Old Testament, the idea of being a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. You know, you're chosen by God. You're his special possession. It's him who has called Israel out of the darkness and into the light. It's him who calls the church out of darkness and makes them into a people and brings them into the light. Coming back to the language we used on Sunday, God is the star of the story. And it's this idea of him being front and center, of him being the star, and us being just the supporting actors, that I'd like to focus on for the final part of our conversations this week. As we think ahead in our groups to what the autumn term might hold for SBC, to the plans that we're going to be making for harvest in a few weeks' time, for remembrance, for Christmas, to our hopes and dreams for what these coming months might hold, how does it change our view of what lies ahead to consider that God is the star of the story? Are there particular things that we need to be doing at the moment, agreeing with ourselves in our home groups, principles to sort of keep coming back to, so that we're going to keep, not just this week, but next week, the weeks that follow, reminding ourselves that he is the star of the story? Why don't you take some time just to discuss that now? And can you take time as well to pray amongst yourselves about what these coming months will hold for our church? Time then again for the final part of this week's discussion to hit that pause button and talk about this amongst yourselves. Well, friends, I hope it's been an encouragement for you to gather this week. And as the conversations draw to a close, let me finish with a blessing. This is a poem called Glint by Gerard Kelly. The blessings of the highest sky be yours in fiercest storm, in deepest dark. The flare and the flicker of the goodness of God highlight your horizon. His burnished breadcrumb trail of beauty shine to show your way home. The sighs of the Spirit soar in you, a rising shout, a rising song, the sweet delight of reassuring light to flood and fill your soul. May peace be yours. Amen. Friends, bye for now. And I look forward to seeing you on another one of these videos in the coming weeks. God bless.